The town of Red Hollow baked under a dying sun, its wooden storefronts glowing amber in the desert heat. Laughter spilled from the saloon doors as ranch hands, already deep in whiskey, entertained themselves with cruelty. They had captured an Apache woman days earlier during a skirmish near the northern ridge. She stood now in the center of the dusty street, wrists loosely bound, chin lifted despite the jeers. There was no fear in her eyes, only a steady, assessing calm that unsettled anyone who dared hold her gaze too long. Inside the Silver Spur, the mood turned uglier with each drink. Someone joked that she should be handed off like a prize calf at auction. Another suggested giving her to the quiet rancher who never joined their mockery. Caleb Turner sat alone near the back wall, hat low over his brow, nursing a single glass he hadn't touched in minutes. Since his wife's passing, he had become a man of few words and fewer smiles. He worked his land, kept to himself, and avoided trouble. That was precisely why they chose him. With a shove and a roar of laughter, they pushed her toward his table. "Here you go, Turner," one of them sneered. "A gift. Maybe she'll teach you how to smile again." The saloon quieted just enough to watch his reaction. Caleb rose slowly. He didn't look at the men, he looked at her. Dust streaked her cheek, but her posture remained proud, almost regal. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Caleb reached into his pocket, pulled a small knife, and cut the rope binding her wrists. The sound of fibers snapping seemed louder than the laughter had been. "She's no one's gift," he said quietly. A few men grumbled, but none challenged him directly. Caleb placed coins on the table for his untouched drink, then walked out into the warm evening air. After a brief pause, she followed. They rode in silence toward his isolated ranch miles beyond town. The sky deepened into violet, and wind carried the scent of an approaching storm. When they reached the small wooden house, Caleb lit a lantern and set it by the door. He gestured toward the open land. "You're free," he said. She studied him carefully, then stepped inside instead of leaving. The door closed against the rising wind. For the first time, she spoke, her voice low but certain. "We're alone," she said, meeting his eyes without hesitation. "Now let's do what needs doing." Outside, thunder rolled across the desert plains, and far off in the distance, faint shadows of riders moved against the darkening horizon. The storm broke just after midnight, slamming against the ranch house with sheets of rain and hard desert wind. The lantern flame flickered wildly as Caleb barred the door and checked the rifle above the mantel. The woman stood near the window, watching the darkness as if she could see through it. When lightning split the sky, it illuminated shapes moving beyond the fence line, riders, low in their saddles, circling like wolves. "They followed," she said calmly. Caleb didn't ask how she knew. He could feel it in the air, the same tension that comes before a cattle stampede. He handed her a spare revolver. She took it without hesitation, checking the chamber with practiced ease. Whatever the men in town had assumed about her, they had been wrong. Gunfire erupted from the north side of the barn. Wood splintered. One of Caleb's horses screamed. He moved to the back door, motioning for her to stay low. Instead, she moved beside him. "They want me silenced," she said. "Not you." "That may be," Caleb replied, cocking his rifle. "But they're on my land now." Another flash of lightning revealed 3 riders dismounting near the corral. Caleb fired first, the crack of his rifle swallowed by thunder. One attacker fell. The others scattered for cover, returning fire. Bullets tore through the porch railing. The woman moved swiftly toward the side window and shot with steady precision, forcing 2 men to retreat behind a water trough. Rain turned the dirt yard into slick mud. Caleb stepped outside under cover of darkness, circling toward the barn. She followed without a word. Together they moved with instinctive coordination, he covering high ground, she advancing low and fast between shadows. A shout cut through the storm. One of the attackers lunged from behind the barn door, knife raised. She disarmed him in a blur of motion, striking with controlled force before Caleb finished the threat with a single shot. The remaining riders fled into the storm, vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. Silence returned, broken only by rain tapping against tin roofing. Caleb lowered his weapon slowly. 2 bodies lay still in the yard. The barn smoldered where a stray bullet had struck a lantern, but the fire had died in the rain. Inside the house once more, soaked and breathing hard, he looked at her differently now, not as someone needing protection, but as someone who had chosen this battlefield deliberately. "You knew they'd track you here," he said. She nodded once. "I needed ground they wouldn't expect," she answered. "And a man who would stand." The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the small ranch house, an unspoken alliance had already formed. Morning came heavy and gray, the storm clouds dragging low across the valley as if reluctant to move on. The ranch yard smelled of wet earth and gunpowder. Caleb buried the 2 men beyond the fence line without ceremony. The woman stood at a distance, watching the horizon rather than the graves. She did not appear shaken. If anything, she seemed resolved. By midday, riders passed along the far ridge, scouts, not bold enough to approach but close enough to remind them they were being watched. Caleb leaned against the porch railing, hat pulled low, studying their movement. Trouble in Red Hollow rarely stopped after one failed attempt. Inside the house, she cleaned the revolver with careful attention. "They work for Crow," she said finally. Caleb's jaw tightened at the name. Harlan Crow had been buying land across the valley for months, forcing ranchers out with threats disguised as contracts. Those who resisted found fences burned, wells poisoned, or cattle stolen. Caleb had refused every offer. "He wants the railroad through here," Caleb replied. "And I'm in the way." "And my people are in the way," she added evenly. The truth settled between them like dust. She explained how crows hired bounty hunters had attacked her village at dawn weeks earlier, driving families from their land to clear the valley. She had allowed herself to be taken, listening as the men boasted about their plans in saloons and camps. She had learned Crow intended to crush any alliance between settlers and Apache survivors. Division made conquest easier. "You chose this ranch," Caleb realized. "Yes." He let out a slow breath. "You could have run last night." "I do not run," she answered quietly. The words mirrored his own from the night before, and something unspoken shifted. Over the next days, they worked side by side. Caleb repaired damaged fencing while she tended the frightened horses. They spoke little, but the silence felt different now, no longer guarded, but steady. At dusk, they shared simple meals, eyes often drifting toward the distant ridge. On the 3rd evening, smoke rose faintly from beyond the hills, signal fires. Not random. Intentional. "My people," she said softly. "Friends?" Caleb asked. She nodded. "Watching." Caleb removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. "Then maybe it's time we stop waiting." She stepped beside him, gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "Yes," she said. "Now we decide what needs doing." Far across the valley, riders gathered under Crow's banner, unaware that the isolated ranch they intended to break had already become the center of something far stronger than either of them had expected. Dawn broke in streaks of red and gold, painting the valley in the color of warning. Caleb had been awake long before the first light, loading ammunition onto the porch table and checking the rifle sights one final time. The ranch no longer looked like a quiet homestead. Wagon wheels had been repositioned as barricades, water troughs overturned for cover, and spare lumber stacked to narrow the main approach. Beside him, she moved with quiet certainty, tying back her hair and fastening a knife at her waist. Across the ridge, dust plumes rose like gathering storm clouds. Crow was coming in force. Before the riders descended, figures appeared from the opposite hills, Apache survivors answering the signal fires. They moved swiftly, taking positions along the rocky outcrops overlooking the ranch. Caleb watched them with measured respect. This was no longer his fight alone. The first gunshot shattered the stillness. Crow's men rode hard, expecting fear and surrender. Instead, they met organized resistance. Shots rang from both sides of the valley, echoing against stone and open sky. Horses reared, men scattered for cover, and the careful formation dissolved into chaos. Caleb held the porch line, steady and precise, while she moved along the side of the house directing fire from higher ground. She signaled her people with sharp hand gestures, coordinating flanking movements that boxed Crow's riders into exposed terrain. What had been meant as an intimidation display quickly turned into a costly miscalculation. Crow himself rode near the rear, barking orders, disbelief etched across his face as his advantage slipped away. When one of his lieutenants fell from the saddle, the rest began to falter. They had not expected unity. They had counted on isolation and fear. Within an hour, the tide had turned. Crow signaled retreat, fury evident even from a distance. His remaining riders withdrew in disarray, disappearing back toward Red Hollow. The valley fell quiet except for the restless snorts of horses and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Smoke drifted lightly from spent cartridges. The ranch still stood. Caleb stepped down from the porch, scanning the hills where Apache warriors now emerged from cover. There was no cheering, no celebration, only nods of acknowledgement between people who understood what had been defended. She walked toward him, dust on her boots, eyes steady. "He will not forget this," Caleb said. "Neither will we," she replied. For the first time, Red Hollow's power had been challenged and held back. And in the growing light of a new day, the ranch was no longer a lonely outpost, it was a line drawn in the earth, defended by choice, not circumstance.